Welcome, everybody, and thank you for joining us. My name is Jackson. I'm going to be your WebEx host for today's session, which means I'm here to help you in case you have any technical issues. So if anything does come up, please let me know in the chat panel, bottom right corner of your screen. I am happy to help you there. Our facilitators today are Minjon, Tholen, and Kimberly, Rattley. They're going to take us through our content. So, ladies, I'm going to pass it over to you, and it's yours when you're ready.
Great. Thank you, Jackie. So welcome, everyone. Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are located. My name is Minjon Tholen, and I'm one of the senior consultants here at Cook Ross.
And I am Kimberly Rattley, and I'm also a senior consultant here at Cook Ross. And we're really happy to be here and having an opportunity to have this conversation with everybody on what happens when you're experiencing bias and what do you do about it. So for those that are on the WebEx and are able to see, we're kind of going through the slides. If you're just tuning in through the audio, just we'll follow along and tell you what's on these slides. So we have some objectives for this time together. Minjon and I have had a chance to develop this content and really coming out of some needs that we've seen our clients have. So for our time together, we're going to look at how to assess the situation objectively, again, if you're the recipient of it. How to acknowledge and manage your emotions. We know we are not robots, so we all have emotions that we want to learn how to acknowledge as well as help them be useful for us. A key component of our time will be practicing courageous and authentic conversations so that we can, again, sustain and even build on these relationships that maybe have some concern for us. And then as well, improve how we relate to everyone in the future. So there's a little bit of a process we'll go through. We'll kind of help you become familiar with some of our concepts, which we talk about around bias, and particularly some terms around micro-behaviors. We have a really cool tool that we call the pause model. And for those that are familiar with the Cook Ross content, this might be a little bit of a twist and hopefully, again, a deeper understanding of how to use this particular tool. And then Minjon has actually developed quite a bit of new content, which I'm excited to walk through with you as well, on expanding the conversation. And then we'll have a good amount of time. We'll see. We've planned for like 15 minutes at the end of the call for questions and answers.
Great. And one thing that we would hope to get from you today is a lot of your participation. And as we go through the session today, there's going to be a lot of opportunity for that. So we hope you'll join us in that. So first, let's get started with the terminology. As Kimberly mentioned, we just want to make sure we're all on the same page about the topics of bias and micro-behaviors. So some of you are probably very familiar with this, but we just like to walk you through it just so that we know what we're talking about. And what we know about bias, right, unconscious bias, is that it is a natural function of the human brain. It's really the automatic tendency that we have to judge, the automatic reactions that we have to people. And it often happens without our awareness, intention, or control. And what we also know is that those biases can translate into our behavior. And what we know is that our biases are impacted by our background. So they don't just exist. They come from the things that we've learned and experienced over time. So what we're going to talk about today is specifically about these things that we call micro-behaviors, and we're going to explore those in just a moment. But it's important for us to distinguish these from blatant forms of discrimination, right? Today, we're not going to talk about if it's very clear that something discriminatory is happening, because of course those are within the business context, things that need to be brought to the attention of the appropriate people in the organization. We're going to talk more about those situations where you're feeling a certain way, but you're not quite sure what that's about. You just start to sense that there's something off, and how to then explore that. So we, of course, can think of many forms of obvious discrimination and biases, both in our workplaces and in our societies. But today, we're going to talk more about the subtle types of experiences that may be the result of unconscious biases of others. Okay, so just for clarity's sake. So let's talk about these behaviors. Micro-behaviors can create advantages for some and disadvantages for others. So what do we mean by that? Let's explore that for a moment. So micro-disadvantages are small acts which are hard to see, and they're often unconscious. We don't realize that we provide these small disadvantages to people, right? It's kind of subtle messaging in how we language things, how we behave, and it has the result of people feeling a certain way. So what's interesting about micro-behaviors are that usually we're not aware of the fact that we're sending them. And we're also not always aware of the fact that we're on the receiving end of it. We're just left feeling a certain way, right? So I'll give you just a quick example on both sides of how I might disadvantage someone else and how I've noticed some disadvantages. For example, as a younger person working with senior leaders in organizations, sometimes I notice that the way that leaders talk to me versus perhaps one of my who looks more seasoned colleague, they might automatically assume that that person is the most senior consultant in the room or the person that they will interact with, as opposed to myself, for example. So I notice sometimes based on that's potentially a disadvantage that I'm experiencing. On the other hand, I notice that sometimes I disadvantage someone else in my behavior by, for example, interrupting someone who speaks really slowly, because I like to get to the point. So you can see that they're small things, but they certainly have an impact, as you probably know. So on the other side of that, there are some advantages that behaviors can provide. So it reminds me of an experience that Kimberly and I had a few years ago when we went to India. And because I'm not Indian, but I look Indian, people would address me and not Kimberly. And so what we started to notice was that I got an advantage by being seen in that way, and Kimberly was not seen.
Yes, oh, it was terrible. I was exhausted by the first week there, everybody. It was like no one was looking at me and constantly talking to you. It really had a strong impact. Exactly, and of course, living in the United States, I'm not used to people looking like me. So when I was in a context where it was the case, people assumed that I was like them, and so there was this interaction that happened. So that's a small advantage. On the other hand, I might, for example, advantage someone who is more tenured because I tend to pay more attention to them when they speak in a meeting, right? So one of the things to remember about micro-behaviors is that we're typically always sending and receiving them. And when we are on the receiving end of them, we sometimes don't realize that we're also sending them. So we're going to talk mostly today about when we're on the receiving end of these behaviors so that we can address them. But we will later on talk about these other things as well. But what I'd like to just hear from you is some of the behaviors that you might have experienced. What are some of the micro-behaviors that you've noticed? And this is a poll. So Jackie, if you can help us set up the poll, then we can get your input. And if you see something on here that you can relate to, the behaviors that you've experienced in your world, then feel free to select those options in the poll. If there's something that's not there, then feel free to add that in the chat as well. So let's just say, for those that are on the line, here's the questions that people are having a chance to respond to. So your ideas are quickly dismissed. People tend to avoid eye contact with you. Colleagues rarely ask you for your advice or input. You don't get a lot of high-profile or stretch opportunities. People tend to mispronounce your name. You're often interrupted. You are rarely asked out for lunch or other social activities, or when you're speaking, the other person or people just seem to be distracted. So if you can kind of relate to those, you can keep that in the back of your mind if you're in our audio version. And in a moment, we're going to hear live what our participants are. Again, you can vote for more than one if you find yourself having experienced any of these examples. And we are certainly intending these just as examples to get our conversation going. We know there's multiple other examples as well. So we'll just wait another moment or two.
I did set the poll for 2 minutes, but definitely I will close it ahead of time if we're done early. Select all the responses that apply and click on Submit on the bottom right corner of the screen when you are done selecting your responses.
Great, and as we're waiting for that, there's also some thoughts that are coming in through the chat, so let's take a look at those. Monica, you said being called Maria, which is not your name, and people hear your accent, right? That's interesting, right? And that might be based, is that perhaps based on the accent, language, ethnicity, or perceived ethnicity with that? So that could be the reason. Some names, right? How our names are pronounced or assumptions about names could be a micro-behavior you're experiencing. So your ideas are heavily scrutinized and questioned. And that's interesting, right? And why is that, right? We're going to explore in just a moment how to then try to understand how some of the things that we're noticing, they may be the result of bias and they may not be. So we want to distinguish between that. So we'll talk about that in a moment. Great. Passive-aggressive behavior, acting like they think our idea is great but feeling it behind closed doors.
Wow.
Interesting, Sabrina. Thank you for that. So ideas that are that you share, and then later you hear that the idea is being mentioned by someone else, and then they're getting the credit for it. That's something that I'm sure many of us can relate to as well. Thank you very much. So I appreciate your thoughts via chat. And Jackie, do we have the poll results as well? Very good. So we see here that there's many of you can relate to a lot of these, and probably to multiple, right? And something again to remember is that as we are experiencing them, we sometimes are probably also showing those behaviors to others, right? And so that's both ways, but certainly many of us can relate to experiencing them. So as we go through this session today, we want to recognize, of course, that these behaviors, right, that lead to some advantages for some and disadvantages for others, can create over time these micro inequities and micro disparities in our organization. And so Kimberly will talk a little bit more about why it's therefore so important for us to talk about this, because we have, of course, many of you are probably familiar with talking about bias as we are ourselves biased, but there's also us receiving bias from others, and there is an impact in the workplace, both of them. Kimberly.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. You know, what's interesting is having done quite a bit of work now on micro behaviors, I'm experiencing these, the results of micro behaviors continuing really do have a dramatic impact on businesses. And there's some clearly identified costs that happen on an individual level, but then as we think about this starts to happen more systemically. Where, individually people can really lose their self-esteem, and many of you use that example of my ideas are quickly dismissed, right? So that immediately can start to make people self-doubt themselves. Do I have a good idea? And that can turn into a certain level of withdrawal. Again, whether you're sitting in the meeting, but your body is there, but your mind is somewhere else, right? You're withdrawing, and that can certainly happen more dramatically. I think it's really interesting when we start talking about the need for problem solving and how creativity can be discouraged. Because again, as people start to experience not feeling valued, their willingness to take risks can really be diminished. Amazing amount of research scientifically on the physical and mental health challenges. This can turn into panic attacks, anxiety, depression. I mean, these are very serious, particularly as we talk this through, the repetitive nature of small subtle behaviors over time really start to damage people individually and also organizationally. Now, the flip side of that, everybody is, well, why are we doing this? Why are we, again, there's a human aspect to the impact on bias, but let's really take that to a larger, systemic level. What happens when people start to feel valued? Well, what we know is that morale can increase, which can hopefully lead to people having a greater sense of wanting to produce, and as they produce more, their performance can go up, and then as we get in there, we're talking about a highly engaged workforce. Now, I find it's so funny when, again, having gone through this kind of content for a while, this whole idea of how do I experience respect, right? And we know we all have different backgrounds and there's a complex identity, but when I don't feel respected, it's really hard for me to be highly engaged. I don't feel, therefore my desire to contribute more to any kind of problem solving or team really starts to diminish. Another really interesting part about that is when we start thinking about work, that when people individually start to feel dismissed, it turns into not just that am I withdrawing, but let's say there's a deadline coming up. I may not tell my boss about it, right? Unfortunately, let's say that even there's some dismissive behavior happening with my boss. I might not be as proactive to follow up for him or her on where there might be some problems. And I think we want to create environments where, again, there can be a lot of co-responsibility and accountability between coworkers and across lines of, hierarchy, et cetera. And then the good news can be, if there's a more inclusive environment, then people will self-correct. There doesn't need to be necessarily that kind of micromanaging that sometimes happens in more toxic environments. So we clearly know we're going in the right direction from an organizational or even individual standpoint on really addressing these issues. So here's the tool I was speaking to. So for those that have gone through some of the Quick Cross seminars in the past, Many people love our pause model as a kind of quick way to think about how do I look at bias when I might be contributing to it, right? How might it happen if I'm if I'm doing some unconscious bias? Well, we've flipped it around for you folks, and we're going to take the pause button back to what can I do when I'm experiencing it? So let's just quickly go through it. Minjon and I will go back and forth around really breaking down these particular steps, but here's the overall diagram for you. So we have P, which in this case means pay attention. But pay attention to your emotions and then how you might be interpreting the situation. The A in this model stands for assess the actual behaviors and the patterns that might be occurring in this dynamic. U is step back. Might there be other interpretations for exactly the behaviors you're experiencing? S is search, again, for the most empowering way to empower yourself. And then finally, E for today will be execute your action plan. So that's the overview, folks. Let's get into it. We're going to go through this tool step by step now.
Great. And as we do that, we will, like Kimberly said, go back and forth, and we'll have some examples to share with you. But also, this is an opportunity for you to look at the situations you might be experiencing, right? Because this is, some of you probably have joined because you're interested in thinking about how to deal with this current situation at hand, or something that you have experienced in the past or that you think might in the future. So really try to see how this plays out for you, and we'll get you engaged as we go through this. So let's start with the P, right? To pay attention to your own emotions and interpretations. And this is a very important step because when we experience bias, right, or when we think we're experiencing bias, what we experience first is the emotional reaction to that. And we want to honor that. We want to recognize that we are emotional beings, right, we're human. And so when things are happening, and again, with those behaviors, we might not be realizing the exact behaviors, we just are left feeling a certain way. So that's why we're starting here, to really honor and recognize those feelings. I just want to really pause for just a moment here because I'm seeing some chat response about not seeing the slides. Jackie, is there anything that we need to resolve, or are we okay?
I'm going to start working with them. Thanks, Minjon.
Okay, thank you, Jackie. Great. So to make sure everyone can follow along, in the meantime, we will share everything verbally that's on the slides as well. So you won't be missing that part if you are not seeing something there. So the first thing to consider under paying attention to your feelings is to just identify the feelings, right? And this is about compassion for yourself, to recognize and honor the emotions that you're experiencing. Now, whether or not this is bias, as we go through the session today, we'll start to help you figure out if, we can identify that. But first is to notice you're feeling a certain way, and that's important, right? So that's one piece under that. And you might be feeling upset, or you might be feeling angry, or not valued, or whatever else, and we're going to talk about that in just a moment. Then the next step about that is to then think about, well, what is getting triggered here? Because what we also know is that when there's a strong emotion associated with something, that's usually because something in our past gets triggered. And we at Cook Ross would say if something is hysterical, it's usually historical. So in other words, if I have a strong emotion, it might be based on my past. And this is a process that helps us to become more self-aware, right, about what's going on with us. And it's part of that is caretaking, right, for ourselves. And the other part of that is just to start the analysis process here. And it's meant to be empowering because what we also know is the statement within the Buddhist tradition, which is that what I can observe, I am not. So if I start to observe my emotions, I start to already be working with them in a different way, you can imagine. So Kimberly, I just am curious, I know we've talked about an example where you had a particular situation where some of these emotions got triggered. So would you be able to share that?
I hope it doesn't come up alive now, folks, because it was a pretty strong experience. I was in another country. I'm based here in the U.S. and I was on a traveling engagement. And the dynamic was I was piloting a new program in this again, another country, and I actually had a person who I was training. It was his first time actually being in this training environment with me. He actually was from the country, a native to the country that I was presenting at. So here's the situation. When I went into when I was connecting, let's put it that way, with the on-site client, the on-site client was not, here's a very classic situation. The on-site client, I was asking the on-site client questions, and I'm looking at the client, and the client would repeatedly turn her attention over to the, again, in this sense, the junior employee, the person who was completely new to the program. And this happened multiple times. So I'm repeatedly looking at the client, actually, shaking the person's hand, and their eyes were completely looking over at this other person. So here's this small behavior that stirred up a lot of feelings in me. And I'm in my business mode, so I'm actually totally not showing it. I'm still consistently sort of smiling at this person and trying to, continue the rapport. But inside, I'm feeling very discounted, and I'm feeling very upset. And so that was the beginning of this moment.
Thank you. Thank you. And so you can hear in this that a small behavior can stir up a lot of serious emotions in us. And I'd like to just hear from you now. We're going to go into a poll here to check some of the emotions that you've noticed when you experience bias, or when you felt like you were experiencing bias. And they can be a lot of different emotions. So, for example, you could feel excluded, neglected, uninspired, desperate, hurt, anxious, maybe upset or defensive or invisible, angry, not heard, deflated, right? Or even undervalued, sad, disengaged, frustrated, pessimistic, discouraged, and maybe many others. So we're going to ask you in a poll here to just select all the feelings that you felt in those moments, or that you can imagine someone feeling. And if you have any that are not listed, of course, feel free to put them in the chat. But this is just to get a sense of the emotion that might be happening when we go through.
Yeah, what's amazing is just thinking about that, that experience back. It's it truly, I had multiple feelings on that, right? So I certainly did have a sense of feeling excluded and hurt, anxious. Now, it was interesting, what isn't on here a little bit, Minjon, that I also started to feel a little bit of excitement, because I was actually feeling this little competitive moment of, I actually knew I was, had the, quote, power position at that moment with this client, and I was thinking about, when is this going to turn around? How is this going to turn around? So I will say, these are layered feelings, and often, again, we have to sort of sort out how we're feeling. I see someone is completely talking about feeling defeated as well. So
great.
Give another moment here.
Great. Wonderful. So we can go ahead and close the poll here and take a look. And in the meantime, as we do that, I'd like to just see what you are sharing in the chat. And like you said, Denise saying you feel defeated. Here's a note about, I had a situation where a new employer who I supervised would ask me questions, I would give her the answer, and then she would ask my coworker the same question. And you feel disrespected, right, or disconnected. That's another one of those, right? And we know that connection is very closely tied to inclusion and engagement. So that certainly has a major impact. Judgmental, interesting, okay, and totally demotivated.
Yeah, right. And that just really speaks to, again, the demotivation. When we start to talk about how to keep employee engagement, I mean, it's very hard, again, to kind of keep it going when you feel that way.
Absolutely. Good. Well, thank you for that. And we are going to take a look at some of the other things that you have selected here.
We're going to see our full results here in just a sec.
And as we think about this, right? I mean, we're taking it step by step. So in just a moment, we're going to shift to the behaviors of others. We're first starting with our own emotions. So that's the process here. And I see here, excluded is getting a lot of responses, defensive, right? And this is what's interesting. What we know about brain science, right, is that if we feel unsafe, we are in our what we call our fast brain, our survival mode. And our survival mode is all about fight or flight. And that means defensive, we disconnect, right, those things that happen. And those are part of our survival mechanism. So those are very natural things that we might experience.
Defensive came up really strong, everybody, and discouraged, undervalued, frustrated.
Absolutely. So those are all types of feelings that could happen when we feel like there's a bias against us, right? So thank you very much for your participation in this poll and in the chat as well, because this is what's human. So now, as we're shifting to the next step here, now we're looking at the behaviors. Because some of, you might be wondering, right, are we just talking about our own emotional reactions, or are we also talking about the behaviors of others? And we are talking about both. And that could, we want to understand those feelings. Like, for example, I just thought of Stephanie, I believe you mentioned afraid. Right? There's fear that could happen. And those emotions are real, but what happens is these emotions are based on things that we observe, consciously or unconsciously, from other people. So now let's look at the observation, which is the A's, assess the actual behaviors and patterns that are occurring. So now we're going to look at the other person or the other factors at hand. So describe the behaviors, right? What are there certain things that are happening verbally, or things being said or spoken or languished in a certain way? Are there nonverbal signs? Right, when someone doesn't look you in the eye, for example, it's a nonverbal cue that you're getting. And is that what's triggering the feeling that you're experiencing? And this is really about distinguishing data from interpretation, right? So our feelings and our interpretation are what they are, and we want to honor them, and they're valid. And we want to understand, are we really truly dealing with a bias here from someone else? Or is there something else that might be going on that doesn't have more to do with me? And this is not meant, again, to discount those emotions. It's meant to empower you to make sure you have the right data points that you're looking at as you're analyzing the situation. So in addition to the behaviors, there are also potentially some patterns that are happening. Because when a behavior happens once, right, that might still have an impact on you, but it's the repeated nature of these behaviors or different types of behaviors or leaving you feeling a certain way that creates the experience and the disparities over time. So are things being said or done regularly that you start to know that this is not just this one moment, or maybe this person's tired and that's why they're not looking in my eye? There might be something else going on. So it's about clarification, right? It's about what is the big picture here? Let me really understand what's happening. So Kimberly, as you were sharing your example earlier, can you help us identify those behaviors that you were responding to in that moment?
Well, as I said, there was clearly the moments where, from the first engagement, I mean, the person, shook my hand, but as they were shaking my hand, they were again looking at this, in this case, I identified as African American female, and it was a white man of Caucasian descent, again from the same native country. So one of the things I was noticing, and the first engagement went on almost like 10 minutes. I really was watching the number of times that I was looking at the person's face, and they were, again, engaging with my colleagues. Really what happened, which was so empowering, and we'll kind of get to strategies on what you do, that showed me the pattern is as soon as the client walked away, I looked at my colleague, and I just was looking at him straight up, and I said, did you notice anything? And he affirmed. He said, absolutely, Kimberly, I didn't know if he used the word micro-behaviors at the moment, probably didn't, but he said, yeah, you weren't getting any attention. So there was an immediate confirmation, which we don't always get, but in this situation I absolutely got. That pattern of, again, the feeling I was dealing with was feeling dismissed on. That pattern, we were in basically a 3-hour seminar. The pattern whereby I would be standing in a group and I was presenting, and I'm the senior presenter in terms of this particular content, the client repeatedly would engage with my colleagues. At one point was even sitting down, was not in a representative role. So there were multiple moments that I was clear that what I'm seeing is a dismissive behavior that is, and in that sense, I thought was unintentional. Doesn't mean it wasn't impactful, but I did think it was unintentional.
Of course, got it. So both the behavior and the patterns that you started to notice over time, and not just by you, by your colleague as well.
True.
Great. So as you think about this, just another quick poll here to think about, does this resonate for you, right? If you relate to this story about a moment where you didn't feel seen or respected as a professional in that moment, or if this doesn't resonate for you, you can of course select that as well.
So we're doing a green check or a red X. We are going to do a poll here, folks, just like we've been doing up to now. So those, again, in virtual world, just see if you can connect to the story in whatever way or not. And again, just understanding there is a universality to the feelings, but again, the behaviors can be different, but that sense of being devalued can certainly impact.
So one of the steps is, so just to summarize where we are right now, right? We've looked at our own feelings, and now we're looking at the behaviors that are there. And in this process, as you're connecting this right now for yourself, this is something hard, because when we are experiencing this, it's so hard to try to move out of that emotion, right? So what we're doing right now is what we would call, from a brain science perspective, really a slow brain experience, which means that our slow brain, as opposed to our fast reactive brain, is one where we actually observe ourselves, and we're trying to really look at what's going on. And so that's the process that we're engaging in. And we are looking forward to seeing if this situation or a situation like this resonates to you with our poll. So let's take a look here.
I'm going to put the results here in just a moment, everybody.
And just looking at the chat as well. Okay,
oh,
great.
Wow. Look at that, everybody.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm looking at some numbers, and it says, you know, we've got about 128 people in some way resonate with this particular story. So I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but it's certainly something that we can acknowledge is real for all of us. So, you know, as we said, we're guiding you through what we call our pause model. We just went through the P, the A, and U is the next part of our tool. So I'm going to kind of talk that through with everyone for a moment. So the U in this model stands for understand other possible interpretations. What could be the motivation for the behavior? And as we break that down a little bit more, could the other person, these are questions that you can start to ask yourself. Again, you don't know the truth or non-truth of the other person, but this is, again, where you start to challenge, as Minjon was saying, we're starting to engage our slow brain thinking and really sort of sort things through as opposed to just emotionally react. So you might ask yourself some questions. Could the other person have different intentions with their behavior besides what you suspect were, quote, the intentions? Is it possible that they just aren't even aware of the impact of their behavior or the words? And can you, again, imagine, we don't know the truth or not, what could this bias likely be based upon? The second question, and I'll kind of walk through again my example to show you how I work through this, but the second part of that U is, how might you have contributed to the dynamic? You know, can you really, and this is where it's consistently an empowering process that we're taking ourselves through, is there some ownership? You know, can you potentially see ways in which you might be contributing to the situation with your own thinking, behaving, or speaking? So first, you know, the motivations for the behavior. So, you know, in this sense, with this particular client, what was quite clear by the end of my time there was that she was not conscious of what she was doing. In fact, you know, I have the advantage, folks. I do this kind of work, so I'm, you know, talking about bias in front of people, and I can kind of usually see a transformation by the time of the end of a session with them. And in this particular situation, there was a time in the training where people sort of talk about their personal background. And she particularly talked about how, and here I laid the groundwork for you, this was a pilot. She expressed how anxious she was about having this particular training here. Now, to me, when I sorted some of this through, again, for me, it emotionally brought up a little bit of empathy for her, even though, again, I had felt dismissed. It also made me think, okay, so she's anxious. Is there any safety zone that this woman was in when she was relating, again, to who she considered was from her home country? Was she being, you know, so again, I just kind of challenged myself to think that through a little bit. I want to say the second one about the ownership. Now, this gets really interesting. I actually want to go back to a story Minjon spoke about a moment ago at the beginning, at the top of our time. We talked about India. If you can't hear or not, there is some little pattern going on around eye contact. And Minjon and I had a really big insight. So when we were in India, as I said, for a week's time, there was multiple moments where people were, you know, not giving me eye contact, talking to Minjon. And she and I started to set up a little bit of a process because I noticed that I started to, quote, get lazy, that I started to not even want to engage with people. It started to feel exhausting. And so I would say, so we set up this little game, Minjon, this is the way to sort of frame it, where if a person was talking to Minjon, Minjon would literally step aside and I would put my face in front of the person. Okay? Now, it's funny, but it was an empowering place for me because I started to notice, and I said, Minjon, we're going to be here a long time. I want to build some cultural sensitivity here. I don't want to just relax. So I did take, again, some responsibility to the fact that I could have co-created this sense of being dismissed, in, particularly in India at this moment.
Right, right, and I think that that's a great example. And so, and I just want to clarify, when we talk about ownership, sometimes it might lend to some of us as a victim blaming, quote unquote, step here, and that's not the intention, right? It's just be really clear that when these things are happening and you can start to identify that this might be a result of bias, that does not dismiss the other person's behavior. But like Kimberly said, we're talking about how do you empower yourself in that situation. And the example that you just shared is one of those where, you know, there are some things that help to mitigate that a little bit in a way that was comfortable to you and didn't feel too far out of your comfort zone or inauthentic in any kind of way. It was just a way to challenge yourself. And that worked pretty well over time. And so we're just talking about some distinctions here in that sense, and to be very clear to not say that behavior is still not happening.
Yeah, yeah. So. I think that's a really important distinction in that. So again, these are processes to, again, empower yourself to understand possible other interpretations. So we've gone through three of the pause elements of our toolkit. Here's a question, and we'll ask you to sort of jot. You all have been very active in our chat function, so we're going to ask you to, again, just do that with us for a few minutes. Now, what do these three steps we've discussed so far tell you about your situation? Has anyone had an aha, a confirmation, a question that you're still sort of lingering with? We want to sort of stop, pause in the middle of our pause for a moment, and give you a chance to utilize the tool and think it through. So in the chat function, where are you thinking now? What so far is starting to appear for you? We'll take a moment to just give everyone a chance to chat down a couple thoughts. Confirmation, thanks. Yeah, lots of confirmation coming through. Great, great.
And what I hope that's happening for you in that is that the confirmation is an empowering form of confirmation, right? It's meant to give you clarity, you know. And again, when we mentioned earlier, when these things happen, we tend to have a lot of emotions and feelings, and so sorting this out can give you a clear sense of, okay, I do really think that there's an issue here. And then now that we're doing this, we can, in a moment, are going to talk about now what to do. But this process of sort of analyzing and feeling this apart can give you a sense of confirmation. Now, it might also mean that at some point you realize, you know what, I don't think that was really a bias. That was more about my interpretation of that. That could happen. But when it does confirm it, it's in a perhaps a broader way than it might have been at first.
Yeah, and I see in the chat function, you know, several of you are saying, okay, so what do we do? And like Minjon said, I think this process of empowering yourself, taking in your own interpretation can help you, help you really slow down. Thank you, and feel like you're clear. Yesterday I was talking with one of our colleagues, and we had this term, how to act more from a design versus a default mode, right? So the default can be that we feel stuck, we feel like we can do nothing. The design, but how do we design our future in these interactions? Great.
And I just want to respond here. Heidi, you mentioned that this distinction between reaction to micro disadvantages, not because of what the other person is saying or doing, but about our reaction. And we're talking about both here, right? As I mentioned earlier, that does not mean that those behaviors are not happening. Right? The behaviors are happening, which is why we have a particular reaction to it. And the emotions that get triggered could be, they're triggered by the behavior, but what our brains do, right, to make sense of the world is we see the behavior and we link it to something. We link it to a particular interpretation of that. When we've seen it in the past, have seen it happening to us, to others. For example, I'll give you a really personal example. Sometimes when people are meeting, whether that's friends or professionally, sometimes I might feel a little excluded, right? It's an emotional reaction to the fact that people are meeting without me. But at the same time, when I try to peel it apart, I realize that growing up, I've had experiences as a child of being excluded from, you know, in school. And so I know that the particular strong emotion that's happening, it's also in reaction to what's happening, but it's also a personal, deeper level of emotion that gets triggered there. And it's important for me to distinguish that so I don't project my past onto the present and not be able to distinguish those two. And that's the process that we're in, is to be able to make those distinctions so that we can actually address the situation at hand and not some of these other factors. So I hope that clarifies it for you. And thank you for that question.
It's interesting too, and I just want to pick up on that, because I also think that the ability of sort of, as we're getting into here to managing your emotions, is that, clearly, again, there's an emotional reaction, but sometimes the sting becomes a little less painful as we interact and find solutions or strategies that work in those same situations. Right? So as we think about my example, I faced similar situations. There was a person up here who was discussing, the cultural nuances of my being in India and how that cultural piece may have played out with the eye contact piece. And I can say, and whether I'm going back to India this, with you or not, because Minjon travels all over the world, folks. The point is that my reaction, my emotional, the volume of my emotions actually diminishes. Even though I might feel something, I don't feel it with the same level of emotional intensity as I practice some of this. So I think there's an interesting switch there. So we're going to move forward. So you've been waiting for this, folks. We're going to go into sort of, so what do you do? What do you do? What are some, the S stands for search for the most empowering strategy. All right, so we've been saying determine if this is perceived bias or whether you have sufficient information to suspect bias is at play. How do you do this? How do you clarify that situation? Well, there's a couple different ways that we like to talk about. Certainly the process of what we've talked through is looking through what is, what do we know are some of the our own individual actions we can take, but we also want to think through, are there some interpersonal interactions we can do? And finally, we want to talk through, are there some other sources of resources by which we can be supported in terms of really determining the right strategy. So what we're going to walk through is identifying what are some of these tangible actions you can take if you have in mind that you want to have a desired outcome to this particular situation. So I'll walk through 3 of these. Again, we'll talk about the individual strategies you might consider, interpersonal, that with someone else, and then again, what are some of the resources that maybe you already know about, but again, just to make yourself aware of. So let's first think about the individual one. It's very basic but very powerful. Reflection in writing. I don't know how many of you all do have the power of writing already sort of established in your life, but one of the actions that I use on a repeated basis is just free flow writing. How can I just let all of my feelings, vent everything out on a page, right? And sometimes the emotions that come out on the page, again, I'm not trying to talk to anyone about them, it already de-escalates and actually starts to clarify what might be, these strong emotions. So, and again, that's just me, myself, and I can just, again, have my private moments. Another thought about individual actions, which I've seen happen for myself as well with some micro behaviors, I can experiment with new behaviors. In fact, this is one of my favorite things. Going back to our example of India, Minjon and I started to have that be sort of a game between the 2 of us based on which situation I was going to stand in front of her, and right. But I was experimenting. It was the other people were not. I wasn't really concerned so much of what they were thinking. I was just interested in developing a new competency with handling a stressful situation. So experimenting is everything you do. There's no right, there's no wrong. You get to try on, again, different ways of handling dynamics that may make you feel uncomfortable. I know several of us mentioned the whole idea of when our ideas are being dismissed in a group and how that small behavior can make you feel like you don't, you start to maybe distrust yourself. And maybe stop, engaging. It's been interesting. As an introvert, I often find myself thinking through things at the end of a team session. People are talking really fast, and I always, still sort of researching in my head what the big picture is. I've started to experiment just with saying this out loud. Just to saying, hey, folks, I need an extra moment or two because it's going to take me a moment to sort of sort through things. Again, this is, my own process. Now, the other piece to this, and this gets us into what Minjon and I have been talking about, we don't want to diminish what bias, the impact of bias. So it is empowering to research your rights. Look through your policies. Really find sources and support from people organizationally so you're clear at, if there are repetitive behaviors that are, really causing me individually to feel diminished, et cetera, and devalued, find out what the policies and the procedures are to support yourself on that. Again, whether you act on it, whether you, quote, file a complaint or not, gaining this knowledge is already empowering to yourself. And one of the other thoughts we have in here is broaden your perspective outside your current situation, you know. And I'm going to assume everybody in some sense wants to, you know, stay where they are and you know, grass is always not greener somewhere else. We know all of that's true. But there's nothing to be said for getting a sense of your value by exploring other options. You know, are there other environments that you would feel more received, more receptive, more valuing of you? If we go back to, again, some of the business costs, we do know that this is one of the stronger reasons why there's a, you know, retention can be hard for organizations, because people don't feel valued. And they do take that option out. They do say for themselves, you know, where else can I go that I might have a different work environment? So those are your own individual options. Let's talk a little bit about interpersonal. Well, one-to-one conversations. You know, how can you sit down with this person? And we're actually going to go through a tool in just a moment about how can you craft or how can you design that conversation. But what can you do? What can you explore with this person around the impact of your behaviors? Arrange for a meeting with a mediating third party is another idea that is something to consider. And then consider written communication. You know, I never really recommend having conflict through writing or email, because we all know it can be easily misinterpreted. But at the same time, you know, you may need to document what you've had. And I want to go back to, again, my situation where I was in this other country, because one of the interpersonal dynamics I did choose to do is we had a code debriefing situation. And in that debrief, I brought up this dynamic to the client. And I expressed that, you know, I had felt that there was some dismissive behavior. Here's what I found out, folks. This particular person had a history. And that, you know, they were really trying to sort of increase the competency with this particular person, you know, on the team, and that this behavior sort of fit some repeated history with this person. So I mention that because it was, again, a very empowering process for me to be able to acknowledge, again, outside of myself and my own interpretation, what was happening. And I see someone else is saying, you know, big fan of documenting. Thank you for putting that all out to the world. That, again, you know, where, when, how is very important. Yeah, and meeting with another person, it can be challenging, right? So this again, the accuracy, or at least the acknowledgement of the behaviors, really does help support what your perception is. Okay, one more of the options, and then we'll kind of get into how this is landing with you. So resources outside of your organization, you know, meeting with people, colleagues in other places, again, finding what's happening outside of that. Always, you know, going directly to the person who might be your direct supervisor, and sort of mentioning the impact on your business results because of this dynamic. Well, again, we'll talk about a tool to do that in a minute. Diversity and inclusion teams can be strong resources within any organization to go with people who are sensitive and sensitized to what does it mean to look at anything through a D&I lens. Can be a resource for you. Employee resource groups, I myself have found several of my friends and colleagues talk about how going to what we call an ERG can really, again, give you that perspective about something that might feel unique to you, but at the same time, maybe is shared by other people within it. Human resources, your EEO office, as well as the employee assistance program. So you know, all of these are potential resources for you. And I wouldn't say you necessarily are escalating the situation, but you want to be able to have a full range of possibilities at your beck and call around how to resolve things. So what do you think now? All right, we've talked about how we are confirming some of our biases. What's most empowering right now when some of you are considering, maybe you're in the midst of one of these bias dynamics, or maybe you've already sort of walked through this. What would you say at this point are some of the most empowering strategies that you could take? We'll take a couple thoughts in the chat function.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Joy, thank you for sharing that. Some of you might be familiar with Landmark or any kind of other types of personal development forums, groups, even just some people it's their religious institution. It can be all kinds of other things that help you to really understand the situation and to make you feel empowered to address what's happening at hand. And talking to a trusted friend is something else. One of the things that's always a challenge, of course, when we're talking to colleagues is that you don't want to contribute to any kind of gossip or rumors or any kind of added negativity that's not needed, right? So you always want to be careful with colleagues, and therefore maybe talking to a trusted friend outside of work can give you a particular objective, maybe more objective perspective, and it also does not contribute to things in the work environment. So whenever that's possible, that's a good option. George mentioned the importance of breathing, and I love that. And this is exactly what we're trying to do with this process. It is about self-awareness and self-empowerment, and breathing through helps us to get some clarity so that we can move forward in empowerment, right? So thank you for that.
Yeah, I like a lot of what I'm hearing here is assuming the positive intent. And again, that's empowering yourself. And whether, again, we can't read what someone else's intent is, but how do you, again, think about this from a standpoint that will allow you to have positive possibilities in the situation. Again, and maybe some of those, unfortunately, might be exiting the situation, but how do you, again, frame it in a way for yourself that allows you to have, again, positive access to your emotions around it and move forward in that sense.
Great. And I see here someone mentioned just documenting patterns, just having this documented, right? That's helpful for yourself to start seeing the patterns, and it's also helpful if it does escalate potentially. You might need evidence. It can show. You can have that as well. Now, one thing to keep in mind with that: make sure that that's confidential, and ideally do that at home as opposed to somewhere on a post-it on your desk, of course.
I love that.
You mentioned the one-on-one discussions and things like that are also powerful interactions.
Rowena, and I hope I'm saying your name correctly, she said even learning American regional cultures can make a difference. As we travel across the world, and Jan and I, it's very clear, again, behaviors are interpreted through the lens by which we see the world, and again, other lenses are also playing out in terms of how we're interpreting that. And being more sensitive to that, is again, an empowering strategy that I've used as well.
Absolutely. Great. Thank you all for that.
Yeah, so we're one letter away now. We're going over to the E.
So, and this is about actually doing it, right? I mean, we've talked about the empowering strategies, and one of the things that sometimes happens is that we have all kinds of great ideas, but then we don't move forward in that. And especially because, as some of you mentioned, some of these actions are really difficult, right, to move forward to, especially if we're talking about someone who's in a superior position to you or otherwise. So, something to consider here is, what is your accountability mechanism? And that could be that you create a plan for yourself. It could be that you have a friend or another way, a buddy who can help you say, hey, did you address that situation already or not? So what works for you to help you actually follow through? Because that's really important. So by the way, Kristen, the S was search for the most empowering option, right? So that's more exploring the breadth of options that you have at your disposal. And then when you've decided on what might be the one or two actions you want to take, now it's about doing that. So an accountability mechanism usually involves a timeline, right? If you need to have a very difficult conversation, you could say to your friend, hey, check in with me next week to make sure that I've done that. And if you haven't, then that's a good reminder. So what is the timeline that you're doing this? Or are you saying, I'm going to give this another 6 months, and then we kind of will see how it evolves. So whatever the timeline is, allow yourself to put some parameters around what you're trying to do, if you will. Then what resources do you need? Do you need a person, a friend, a colleague? Do you need a third party? Or do you need time, other types of resources, whatever that might be, but what is it that you need, right? Some of the other things here is staying attuned to organizational politics and culture. And this could be 3 hours of conversation, but one of the things to remember is that your situation is happening within the context of a larger dynamic. And what I mean by that is, for example, your organization has just gone through a major organizational restructure where the person that is that you feel is showing some bias towards you or about you, and they have gone through a lot of stress about that, you may want to give them just a few days before you talk with them so that you can have the conversation in the best way. If other types of things are influencing the situation, to just be aware of that there might be other dynamics going on. So it's just really keeping the big picture in mind, and it doesn't mean that you should still not follow through. It's just that it allows you to navigate whatever else is going on in your organization at that moment in a more empowered way. Knowing your rights and options, as we said earlier, that's really, really important. And managing your emotions, again, that is not about discounting your emotions. It's about making sure that what you want to bring across and that you want to do is helping you to move forward. And you can still express your emotions, you can feel them, talk about them, but try to do that in a strategic manner for yourself, right? And by that, we really mean keep your needs front and center, whatever those needs are, right? Some people decide that there's actually nothing that they're going to do because they've decided I'm okay with this right now, and that works for me. And if that works for you, then that's okay, right? So just keep yourself, you know, and your own needs really stay attuned to that. So one of the things we want to specifically highlight here in executing your action plan is what we call our 3 I's model. And this is about having those conversations, because as some of you noted, that is what's hard. It's the addressing it and the confrontation with that might be a challenge for us, right? So we wanted to share with you this model, and you've probably seen other versions of this, the SEIR model or other ways to have these courageous conversations, but this is something else to put in your toolbox here. So let me just walk through it, and then I'll give you a quick example of what that could look like. So the first I is about identifying what's happening, and as George mentioned earlier, breathe. Breathe, right? Breathing helps us to stay in the present. It helps us to stay focused. Describe the behavior, right? What is happening? What is the behavior at hand? So this is, again, helpful if you've gone through the steps of the pause model. You have been able to identify the interpretation from the behavior, and that's an important start. Now, then you want to share what your interpretation of that was. That might be a good thing, right? To say, this is what I observed. For example, I felt like I was not being, I felt like I was skipped over in the meeting, and the impact of that to me was that I was not really heard, or my opinion wasn't asked for, and I felt like not valued or something like that. So it's really the identifying, describing, identifying what's happening, and then to investigate, and that's our next step. And some of you mentioned to assume non-negative intent, and that does not mean that there's still biased behavior. Again, to be really clear, it just means that we're giving the other person an opportunity to share with us what's happening from their end, because most of the micro behaviors that we experience in our organizations are not coming from a conscious negative intent. Now, the impact of that could still be negative, but it helps to verify what was happening on the other side, right? So once we have my interpretation, that person's perspective, now we're in the innovation stage. And the first 2 steps are important because one of the things that happens when we give people feedback or have difficult conversations is that the other person gets into, again, fast rate defensive mode, right? If someone tells me I need to share some feedback with you, probably I will have this moment of what's wrong, right? And so I want to make sure that the other person can stay in their slow brain and stay reflective so that they can truly explore this behavior with us, so that they can actually address it and change that. So that's what we're talking about with this, because once you've done that, now you can say, what's my request here? And here are some ideas for you, or you can ask the other person, what are some of your ideas to avoid this? And then the last step here in that is really to allow the other person to grow. I know that when we experience negative emotions, we sometimes don't allow a person to grow from it. We kind of keep holding that grudge, and there are times when that's really hard to let go of. But whenever you can, if the person truly is staying accountable to this changed behavior, that is growth for both of you, right, and particularly for that person. So part of this is to allow this other person to show you that they truly want to correct some of their behavior and sticking to that.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a moment on this, because as we move forward, we're going to look at the other side of this, folks, in terms of how could, should, would someone respond if they do get this input about their behaviors being, dismissive, etc. So we're going to go to the other side as well as we talk about this interpersonal strategy.
Absolutely, absolutely. So we are going to move on here to just give you an example of what this might look like, right? So when we think about the identify, you could say, for example, I noticed in the meeting that you did not comment on the recommendation I made. And the impact here is that it made me feel like you didn't think I added any value. So that's really identifying, right? And then we investigate. did I interpret that correctly, or was it just too much going on in the room? What was happening in this moment? And when the person explains it, then you can say, so going forward, I really hope that you know how much I want to contribute to the team's success and our success, and I would really appreciate any constructive feedback when you feel like I'm missing the mark on something. Or you might say, I would love it if you would just ask my opinion because I do have something to share, but sometimes I feel like I can't jump into the conversation and I need just someone to create space for me. Would you be willing to do that so that I can hold myself accountable to contributing? Right? So in other words, what is the request that you have from them, and what might they need to know about you? So that's the 3 I's model. It's a way to structure the conversation, perhaps. And one of the things I love that I'm seeing in the chat is some of the additional recommendations. Yep. Thank you all, folks, because there is so much more on this, right? We have 90 minutes, so we are trying to manage what we share with you, but I love those recommendations. So definitely keep them coming.
Yeah.
And as we now think about this pause model and all the things that we could be doing, in the chat, can you share with us what you think could stop people from action, and particularly from having a conversation? What happens, do you think? Why don't we have them?
Yeah, what stops people from doing these empowering, particularly this action, feeling intimidated? Thanks.
Yeah. And intimidated by the confrontation or perhaps by the other person?
Organizational culture perpetuates being conflict avoidant. There's lack of time and trust, uncertainty, negative consequences. Exactly. Fear of retribution is a huge one for folks. Power of that other person, positionally, or just even influence. Just that sense of not feeling safe.
And how to frame the conversation. And one of the things, by the way, to really consider here is when you do have the conversation that you want to have, practice it with someone.
Yeah.
Practice it and do some role playing with them and kind of see how you can respond to different reactions so that you had a chance to speak it. Sometimes when we speak it, it sometimes turns out to be much easier, and sometimes it turns out it's harder, so we might want to do some more work in that. There's so much at stake, right? And that's absolutely true as well. This is hard, which is why knowing your options is so important. And fear, with lots of exclamation marks, thank you, because now the question that we're going to shift to is, what inspires you more than fear? Because this is what we want to move through, right? These are human emotions, again, but we want to move through that, to go into action whenever we think that is what helps us to be empowered. So what is more inspiring to you than fear? Please go ahead and share that with us in the poll. Being valued, yeah, that's great. Yeah. Got it. So pain and fatigue, that's costly, right? There's a cost to that. So sometimes working through the fear can help with that. Being heard, self-worth and respect, release.
Seeing results in that relationship, that's great. You know, this concept of what inspires you more than fear, it's one of the kind of slogans we use here in the Cook-Ross world, and it's amazing how that training has actually started to empower me to make new decisions. Because again, I will always feel the feeling behind fear in certain situations, but then I can actually start to quickly shift a little bit faster. I'm a little bit more nimble on my feet to say what inspires me. And I would say spiritually, it's usually me trying to honor my spiritual path that I love that, being a dignified woman of color. Yeah. So you know, as we sort through these feelings, and again using that pause model, Minjon's going to kind of summarize where we are, and then we're going to kind of grab another part of this conversation which I mentioned, and I'll let you go through this, Minjon. I'll just populate it.
Yeah. No. Just to sum us up, right? Is that pausing, these steps can help us to get that clarity and to then get clear also on what would help me work through whatever is stopping me. And hopefully this model can help you to take those steps. And I love that you're putting what inspires you more than fear on your wall right now.
Oh, wow.
And so this is what we're talking about. So thank you for that. And now, as we are going to shift, just to consider that there might be all kinds of opportunities to continue to address microbehaviors, both from our own accountability as well as others. And Russ, for example, has some work. He's done a lot of work on microbehaviors, both as a sender and receiver of this. And we have talked a lot about what if it's happening to me. And one of the things that we want to move on to really is to think about how do we expand the conversation. And these are some things that you might not have expected in this session, but we think it's important to also look at accountability in other ways. So Kimberly, will start that conversation with you really briefly.
Yeah, I mean, again, this is an overview, folks, so we know that these conversations are quite nuanced, and the dynamics I'm going to mention are big thoughts, big concepts that we want to empower ourselves against to think about the whole picture. So for a moment, we're going to talk about, self-correcting micro-behaviors. So what happens when you suspect that you are contributing to an environment where you're giving off a micro-message? How can you start to reflect on your own language and your behaviors? I'm going to give you an example of one soon after I go through these steps around how this concept is really starting to help me grow. And pause if you suspect you may be sending a micro-message. If there's a dynamic which you repeatedly sort of notice that you feel like you've even gotten feedback from someone on, but you keep doing it, there's an ability, again, to learn how to pause before the full impact is actually set in on this other person. Internally reflect and change your words of action. So that really doesn't mean, again, that self-reflection gift that we all have, whether that's writing, whether that's just sitting and pausing with ourselves. Again, this is the personal side of sort of becoming whole. That's really an empowering strategy. And you can also check out with the other person and try to understand, did you do something, right? We've been thinking about the 3I model, which Minjon just went through, but you can act from a standpoint of when I've received it, but how can I also investigate? How can I also go forward and say, hey, I have a sense that when I did this might have been something that, was devaluing to you. Can you confirm if that's true or not?
And I can give a really brief example of that because I've noticed, for example, recently, so one of the things, I'm from the Netherlands, so English is my second language and that I've learned, and I've lived here for a while, but one of the things that I sometimes surprise myself with is certain terminologies or words or expressions that I didn't even know I knew. So what I noticed recently is that I use certain words that I've learned and picked up over time, and then at some point I thought, wait, maybe that's really offensive. And I was in a meeting and I stopped myself mid-sentence and said, wait, maybe that's not a good way to phrase it. And I asked the other person, what do you think? Is this appropriate to say or not? And she said, I'm not sure, but yeah, now that I think about it, maybe that's not the right way to phrase it. And I was like, oh, yeah. So in that moment, we were both kind of exploring it. And it's now whenever that automatically wants to come out of my mouth for whatever reason, I kind of stop myself because I've explored it and realized this might not be it. But it takes intention. But having another person to kind of say, hey, was that appropriate or not, is sometimes a good way to self-correct and to hold yourself accountable to it.
I so relate to that. And so again, who we are in the world is a reflection of our backgrounds. And one aspect of a self-correcting micro-behavior that I still do, and I'm still working on it, folks. So this is, my story is not over, is the use of the word honey. Right? So I will find that, and I'm looking at my two colleagues here in the room, I might have already said it to them on repeated times. So, in some way I consider myself a Southern girl. I'm from like Washington, D.C. We think we're Southerners. And the point is, I grew up with this whole frame of honey and saying honey, male, female, old, young, whatever. And I had one colleague of mine, and he very strongly said, Kimberly, I get offended. I mean, he even used those words, I get offended when you call me honey. Now, the point about this is I really felt when he said that, I said, come on, this is me being kind and, I'm showing you my love, I'm showing you my support of him. I really had to reflect at the fact that he had been very clear with me and said that he didn't want it. Now, here's the challenge. I do still find myself linking into this honey, and I recognize that it's my responsibility to apologize and change the words and actions. Again, commit to avoiding the initial language or behavior going forward. Now, this ability to, again, perceive what you're doing wrong, sometimes you can sit back and you can know what's happening. Let's look at this, though, around if someone does have the courage, as we hope everyone does feel this, to actually receive the feedback. As I shared with you, I had a colleague who directly talked to me about the use of the word honey. I've had multiple other situations now where people will engage with me and say, the terms I'm using, my hand gestures, I happen to often be physical and expressive with my hands. I've had people sort of say, they're distancing, they're saying either non-verbally that they don't appreciate it. So here's some receiving feedback guidelines. Try and do your best. Do a really good job at controlling your defensiveness. You may feel inside defensive, but how do you still stay engaged with this other person and allow them to feel heard?
And this is where breathing is so important. So breathing is important for both the sender and the receiver, by the way, because that helps us, again, to move from defensiveness to hearing it a little bit more.
Okay. And I'm going to walk through this, and we have some other content I want to make sure we can get to as well. Listening to understand. So again, whether you perceive what they're saying is true or not, what they're trying to do is seek, and that means looking at them. That means, as we talked about, is asking them questions, being curious about what they're saying, taking the personal side out of this to just, again, be in their shoes and understand. Reflect, summarize what you hear. You know, is this what you're saying to me when I use the word honey? Is this you're saying it sounds like you consider this offensive? Asking questions, just again, continuing to engage with the person, relating to them as someone you care about, and asking for other examples. Are there other situations that maybe you're doing something that again this person has not found helpful? Asking them for other situations, and taking responsibility, apologizing. You know, this ability, we know that in any interaction we do offend people, we can cause harm. How do we restore these relationships? A core skill, as we all know, is to say, I'm sorry. Be I'm sorry. And think about concrete ways to avoid doing these actions in the future. You know, and allowing, I love what was said earlier, allowing yourself to grow, to be accountable, and to strengthen that relationship. I can't tell you how many of my relationships are stronger because people are engaging with me, are telling me things that they have found unhelpful. All right, and the final comment here is remember. I had a colleague tell me one time that she was getting a lot of feedback from somebody that she just felt was a little bit off. And so out of all of this, know that you get to sort out what is most important for you. Right? Again, how you respond in that conversation, you want to, again, stay open, stay inquisitive, stay open to what, they may be concerned about, but you also get to decide for yourself what you're going to take home around this. How can what you've heard from them be useful?
Great, and so, one of the things that we also know, of course, is that Kimberly shows, of course, a great willingness here to learn around these things, but not everyone does, right? Some people really cannot quite hear it, and that's also true. And that doesn't mean that we're still not accountable for our behaviors, and there's only so much you can control as a person having that conversation. But to just as much as it's hard to give feedback, it also is hard to receive it. And so from both sides, it's helpful to work through that together. And then there is, of course, besides the people that are involved, there is a third-party intervention we just wanted to talk with you about very briefly. And that is around, if you observe something happening, can you also engage with the person who you feel like is showing some bias here? So one of the things here is to share your observations with the person. Again, use the 3 eyes model here. And then you can relate it to your personal experience so that you can explore with the other person what might be going on your end, so that you can talk about what's underneath this and how can we change this. And I just want to very briefly share with you an example in my personal life with my mom that happened around this, because that was a difficult moment. As I mentioned, I'm from the Netherlands, so when I went home a few months ago, when I'm home, we go to restaurants, we have a good time with my parents, and so we went, and I started to notice that my mom would refer to the people serving us. She would, the women, she would talk to them and said to them, girl, in the Dutch word for girl. And she calls me that. It's, again, a very endearing term to her. And I struggle with that. As I mentioned, I tend to be with people who are older than me in the workplace. So what happens is that I'm regularly referred to, or people say girl, or they say some version of a younger female person that I struggle with as a professional in the workplace. So in that moment, I tried to manage my own reaction of saying, Mom, don't say that, right? Mm-hmm. And I tried to say, okay, so Mom, I've noticed that you call the servers, that you call them girl. And I just wanted to share with you that when I'm in the workplace and clients, for example, refer to me as such, I feel a little diminished, and I feel like it's a little paternalistic. I know that that's not their intention. I know that that's not your intention because you call me that as your daughter, but I'm just wondering if that might land for them in that way. And my mother, of course, at first said, well, I'm just trying to be nice, and I understand that, and I know that's probably how they, that might be how they receive it, but I know that I don't like that when I'm in the workplace. And that connection that I had with her allowed her to hear what I was sharing, that I was sharing that. I love what I just saw here in the chat. It's like there's no girls because we have to be of a certain age to work. And so, again, this was not her intention. I know she did not have that at all. It was not what she meant. But me sharing with her something that showed a level of my vulnerability allowed me to leverage my relationship and trusted relationship with my mother for her to hear it. And the rest of the trip, she didn't do that again. Now, I don't know if she still does it, but I know that she could hear it in a different way because I brought myself into that conversation and allowed us to explore. Okay? So that's a third-party intervention. And again, what we're going through here is accountability around this from multiple perspectives. There is an ownership for us if we're experiencing this, but many times we're also at the if you quote unquote offender side of this, right? So we're talking about a system of accountability within ourselves and amongst ourselves.
And I just want to add, as you said that, because I think it's been shared several times on the chat, this assumed positive intent, right? So what we say and how we say it is so critical for the heart-to-heart communication to actually be heard by the other person. So I think, again, as we think about creating safe spaces where everyone feels connected, how we, again, engage with the person who was the closest perpetrator has as much impact in terms of their recovery or their restoration as anything else.
Mm-hmm. Great, absolutely. And so now, two more pieces that we want to add to this, which is we can also be benefiting from bias, right? And so very briefly here, this is, again, around accountability so important that we have to recognize that when we are benefiting from differential treatment as opposed to our colleagues. This is a level of self-awareness and to then take responsibility for that privilege. And you can do that in multiple ways. And one of it is to, when you notice this and there's an opportunity, to leverage your privilege to support others. And that doesn't mean that you talk on behalf of others. It's about how do you create space for others, right? I just love the example of the story I read around, you might be familiar with it, with the Obama administration. There was a story that came out about the women in the administration felt like they weren't heard as much during meetings. And what they started to do is to amplify each other's statements. Whoever could get the listening, they would say, hey, that person made the statement, let's talk about that. And so they called it the amplification effect. And I think that that's a great way of leveraging your own awareness about this and your own privilege so that you can make sure that other people are being heard. And that is also about allyship. That's about you leveraging your own position to really bring everyone forward. Paying it forward, what we mean by that is just to make sure that when you notice that, how can you, in your own behavior, try to avoid that as well? So that's about that and trying to pay forward inclusion, if you will, since you're noticing that. And then the last one is speaking up to your manager, which is hard because when we experience advantages, we kind of like to keep them, right? So we don't want to say, oh, I'm noticing I'm being advantaged, so can you stop that? That's probably not what you want to say because we all as humans like to have positive impact of that, and we also want to have an inclusive environment where everyone can be seen and heard and valued. So then the question is, how can you have a conversation with your manager about, hey, I'm just noticing I'm getting a lot of the opportunities, can I partner with someone on that? Or can we make sure that, I notice I talk a lot, I want to talk a little bit less so that we can make sure we invite other people's voices, what do you think? So it's about how can you work with your superior if they're the ones showing you that kind of beneficial treatment to together try to continue to increase inclusion on the team.
Yeah, I just want to make the point that we are talking sort of in an organizational structure perspective and speaking about managers and supervisors, and yet we know that in any kind of system, so to speak, there are other people who have influence, and whether those are privileged friendships that certain people have, and how do you again invite people out? How do you create situations? I was just talking with a person the other day and who was speaking about not having as much access to a particular person who had a lot of influence. So we strategize. So how do we create an informal interaction between you and this other person? How do we leverage, again, this influential relationship on behalf of someone else? So there's a creativity here. We're just giving you suggestions, and really again, but creating this sense of equity and leverage across any kind of system can really help us all.
Absolutely.
All right, we have one more layer here, folks, and this
yes,
is a great final one for you.
And this is, of course, besides our own individual, interpersonal situations, there is also the organizational context. And one of the things about speaking up, right, we tend to be able to do that in cultures where we feel like we're safe. And some of you mentioned it earlier, what stops us is a sense of not feeling safe, or the culture doesn't allow for those types of interactions. So from an organizational culture perspective, particularly for leaders, to really consider what types of tools do people need, what education can you provide to people that, on an ongoing basis, that continues to put this front and center for people. So that could be training on unconscious bias, micro-behaviors, courageous conversations, giving and receiving feedback, and making sure that everyone is part of that conversation. So not just have that be for people managers, but make sure that your individual contributors also have a chance to explore these topics so you can have these conversations with shared language, right? How can you coach your leaders to continue to giving very productive feedback and receiving it in a good way? That's another ongoing professional development, coaching, support, and structure that could be helpful. Some of the other things to consider here is to clearly define and communicate the support options you have available in the organization. Sometimes I've noticed people don't quite know who to go to. And what they then do is sometimes just scrub it all up, or they talk to their colleagues and they also don't know what to do with it. So how can you make sure that people know what the process is and what the resources are to address these issues when they occur? And of course, what's always most important is leadership commitment, accountability, and modeling of this behavior, so that they send a message to the rest of the organization.
And I just want to, Minjon, as we kind of conclude that last piece, what we have noticed within doing the work in diversity and inclusion is we say that, learning interventions aren't enough, right? That they begin to build the muscle, but we certainly want to create a sense of how do we, beyond just the interpersonal responsibilities, create, again, a climate of awareness and support for, equity and respect.
Absolutely. So let's just summarize, since we've talked a lot over the past hour. So we talked about pausing, right, which is about distinguishing behavior, interpretation, and intention, considering the actions and options available to you, and then to follow through. We've talked about giving feedback through the 3 I's model and receiving it. We've talked about personal accountability, so that when we experience these behaviors, these feelings, we don't want to create those for others, right? So there's a level of personal accountability here that we just always want to keep in mind. And then to really think about the organizational culture and how we can continue to improve that. So now we have a couple minutes left with you all. And there's been a couple requests. We are intending to provide the audio portion of this. I'm not sure if we decided on the actual text. We can. No, I think we're still in discussion around that, folks. But we're sharing the whole recording with. We're going to share the recording with you. Yeah. Certainly, you can Twitter us, you can Facebook us, you can also go to a lot of our LinkedIn support, as well as just coming on over to kukross.com if you want to speak more directly on any of our particular organizational offerings. But for the time we have now, we have a little bit like 5 minutes, and if someone has a question in the chat forum, we can. Minjon and I, and we actually have Natanya here, who's also supporting the process, respond as we can to. And we can also open up the lines too if someone would want to ask a verbal question. Jackie, yeah. Perhaps we can, if you want to give people instructions for that, we have a few minutes in addition to the chat. Yeah, you can just raise your virtual hand. Usually that's how we can start to acknowledge.
Absolutely. If you haven't already opened your participant panel by clicking on the Participants tab on the very top right corner of your WebEx screen, go ahead and do that now. Then you'll be able to see all the panelists listed. Right below that list is a little hand button. And if you click on that, it's towards the very right side of the panel. Click on that. I can see a hand has gone up. Nick, I'm going to go ahead and some hands have gone up and now down. If you'd like to speak up, go ahead and click on that raise hand button. I will unmute your line so that we can hear from you. Great. And in the meantime, as we wait for that, some comments are coming in. And Zina, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, a lot of the conversation was about the one-on-one, and that is very intentional. So we chose this angle because this is a request that we've noticed a lot in our organizations that we work with, because when we
do this type of unconscious bias work or diversity and inclusion work, we try to work with the entire organization, right? And D&I and HR and L&D functions, they're all trying to change and continue to evolve the organization and move that forward. So certainly it is very important to look at the structural, cultural aspects of this. But within the given context, we also want you to be empowered. So that's why we've chosen this approach to give you some tangible tools that are that might be helpful for you as you work through this. Thank you very much for your sharing so far. Anyone who wants to?
Yeah, we have a moment here. If you have a I don't want to say burning request, but something that you think would be helpful to explore for yourself or others, we can take a specific opportunity to respond. Yeah, you know, Minjon, it's interesting as we're considering people having open questions, just even refreshing my mind as we go through this content, it becomes, I've noticed along the way that I've gotten better at these skills. I've noticed along the way that my ability to first even acknowledge my feelings rather than stuff them, right, which is so basic, but finding a way to do that, and then again, searching for appropriate and effective ways to communicate, it actually gets better over time. Yeah, I see a great question here. Are there any courses available for individual diversity consultants? We do have actually a seminar that we do called the Unconscious Bias Learning Lab. And I might suggest that if you go on, again, cookross.com, you can see some of our services and some of the events that are coming up. We do tend to do, and moderately priced in terms of opportunities for you to kind of get exposed to this content, whether it's you or even several people from the organization can come to some of those supports.
They are not online, though. I saw that you asked that. We don't have we have these public webinars, and then we do have a number of other opportunities. So definitely feel free to reach out to us for more information about that. And we hope that this got you thinking about some of these things for yourself as well, and what you could do in this process.
Yeah, and as you look at that, yeah, we don't have this course online, but when you do go to the cookross.com, you can see we even have certain resources for self-paced learning, which you might want to suggest to your organization to take a look at as well. And there's several from that standpoint of really understanding bias. We have several free thought papers that you might want to click over and see on that. And we've recently kind of gotten a robust blog that's going out around topics of interest as well. So take a look at that.
Great, and thank you. We love hearing from you how it's been, how this has been helpful to you in the work that you're doing. So wonderful. Jacqueline, do we have anyone on the line at all who wants to ask a question at this moment, or should we start wrapping up?
I see a hand from Dina. Dina, I'm going to unmute your audio now.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, Dina, we can.
I just wanted to ask, do you all, I guess, resource other organizations that focus on diversity in cities and allow, I guess, have a list that people can look into and join either a society, an org in their local cities to participate in the conversations in general or participate in assistance, like a log of organizations? I don't know.
That's an interesting question. So just to make sure that we understand, so other organizations that are connected to CookRoss in local areas where people can continue the conversation with people in person and things like that. Is that what you're asking?
Partnership, development for oneself in this arena, et cetera, so that you're in the conversation, but obviously in your local city because not everyone lives in the same spot.
Sure. So if that's something that you're interested in, we can, give us a call or send us an email, and we can see who we can connect you to. CookRoss is based in Silver Spring, and we do have online. We're on social media and things like that to continue the conversation in that way. And we do have some, of course, a lot of our work is around personal professional development, but it's not as much in the local areas. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I don't think we have regional sites. I will say, and I saw the comments out there, and that Minjon, Tholen, and Kimberly, Rattley, you can just check out cookross.com. You can access us individually, and we'd be more than happy, excited to sort of keep the conversation going on in that particular way and see what could emerge. We sort of developed this content because we felt a strong need for people, and so who knows where this could go in terms of really expanding it. please do reach out to us individually through our website.
Yeah, and then to wrap us up, Barbara, you mentioned are we allowed to share what we've learned? Please do. It's certainly great to share. Now, one of the things that we always say is share responsibly, right? I mean, if you want to share the recording of this, for example, and watch it with your team, that's a great way to get the information to the other folks firsthand from us, and then to host a conversation around that. One of the things that we always have to recognize, of course, that we've taken you through a lot of content, and that gives the context of what we're talking about. So the context is just as important as the content that you've learned. So put it in the right context, and please share, because it's important for us to that this reaches as many people as possible. So good.
I think that's it. Well, thank you all. Thank you all online. Just on the audio part of this, we really enjoyed this conversation. And again, we are very open to continuing to see what could emerge from this. All right, have a great day wherever you are in the world. Take care.
Bye, everyone.